The morning that changed everything. Monday, August 6, 1945, started like many other mornings in wartime Japan. The sun rose over Hiroshima, a coastal city of roughly 350,000 people. Citizens were recovering from a false alarm earlier that morning. At midnight, air raid sirens had wailed through the streets. People had rushed to their shelters only to receive the all-clear signal at 2:10 a.m. Exhausted, they returned to their beds. Around 7:09 a.m., the sirens screamed again. Hearts racing, families gathered their belongings and prepared for the worst. But this alarm was triggered by just a single American reconnaissance plane flying at high altitude. The all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m. Relief washed over the city. People returned to their normal routines, eating late breakfasts, preparing for work, and beginning another day under the shadow of war. Nobody in Hiroshima could have imagined what was about to happen, and nobody in Tokyo was ready for the news that would soon reach them. The weapon nobody expected. In the skies above, 3 American B-29 bombers were approaching from the south. The lead plane, Enola Gay, carried an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy. Despite its innocent name, this weapon weighed nearly 10,000 pounds and contained the explosive power of more than 15,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese radar operators noticed the planes but weren't particularly concerned. Only 3 aircraft? That didn't constitute a major raid. There was no reason to panic over 3 planes when the Americans had been conducting massive firebombing raids with hundreds of bombers for months. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. It fell for 43 seconds before detonating approximately 2,000 feet above central Hiroshima. The explosion created a fireball that reached temperatures exceeding 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. People within half a mile were instantly vaporized. Buildings collapsed like houses of cards. A mushroom cloud rose rapidly into the sky, climbing to 45,000 feet. At least 80,000 people died within seconds. Many more would die in the hours, days, and weeks to come from burns, injuries, and radiation poisoning. The silence that puzzled Tokyo. In Tokyo, approximately 500 miles away, the first sign that something was wrong came at 8:16 a.m., just 1 minute after the explosion. The Tokyo control operator for the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation noticed that the Hiroshima radio station had suddenly gone silent. This was unusual, but not necessarily alarming. He attempted to use a backup telephone line to re-establish contact. That line was dead too. About 20 minutes later, another red flag appeared. The Tokyo Railroad Telegraph Center realized that the main telegraph line had stopped working just north of Hiroshima. 2 independent communication systems failing at the same time suggested something more serious than a technical glitch. Then the reports began trickling in. Confused, incomplete, and deeply troubling. Small railway stations within 10 miles of Hiroshima sent unofficial messages describing a terrible explosion. The reports were fragmentary and contradictory, but they all pointed to catastrophe. Military headquarters at the Japanese General Staff immediately tried to contact the Army control station in Hiroshima. The phone rang and rang. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. Complete silence. This silence was deeply puzzling to the officers in Tokyo. They knew that no large American bombing raid had occurred. Their radar would have detected hundreds of planes. They also knew that Hiroshima didn't have any large ammunition dumps that could have accidentally detonated. So what had happened? How could an entire city's communications simply disappear? Confusion and disbelief. The Japanese high command found themselves in an impossible situation. They had fragmentary reports suggesting something catastrophic had occurred, but they had no reliable information about what had actually happened. The complete communications blackout meant they couldn't contact anyone in the city to get accurate information. The confusion at headquarters was palpable. Officers debated possible explanations. Some speculated it might be a massive accident. Others wondered if the Americans had developed a new type of bomb. But even the most pessimistic assessments couldn't capture the true scale of what had occurred. Throughout that day, confused reports continued to reach Tokyo. The information described something that seemed almost impossible: an air raid by just a few planes that had leveled an entire city with what witnesses described as a blinding flash and violent blast. The descriptions were so extreme that some officers found them hard to believe. The Japanese military leadership included some of the most experienced officers in the nation. Yet nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for this moment. The idea that a single bomb from a single plane could destroy an entire city seemed to defy everything they knew about warfare. Understanding begins to dawn. Later on August 6th, the Japanese government received President Harry Truman's radio broadcast, announcing the first use of an atomic bomb. Truman's words were stark and threatening, warning that America was prepared to obliterate every productive enterprise Japan had above ground in any city. For the first time, the Japanese High Command had a name for what had happened: an atomic bomb. But understanding the name didn't necessarily mean understanding the reality. The Japanese military had their own atomic research programs, and their scientists understood how extraordinarily difficult it would be to build such a weapon. Many military leaders initially refused to believe the Americans had actually succeeded. Chief of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, expressed a view shared by many in the military leadership. Even if the Americans had built one atomic bomb, he argued, they couldn't possibly have many more. The technology was too complex, the resources required too vast. Perhaps this was a one-time demonstration, a propaganda tool designed to frighten Japan into surrender. This logic led to a tragic conclusion. There was no need to surrender immediately. The military could investigate, verify the reports, and then decide on a course of action. The Japanese military ordered their own scientific teams to travel to Hiroshima and determine exactly what had caused the city's destruction. The cabinet debates. The day after the Hiroshima bombing, the Japanese Imperial Cabinet convened for what would prove to be a heated and lengthy debate. The meeting revealed deep divisions within the Japanese government about how to respond to this new threat. Some cabinet members, particularly those from the civilian government, argued that the atomic bomb demonstrated the futility of continued resistance. If the Americans could destroy entire cities with single bombs, what hope did Japan have? But the military representatives pushed back forcefully. They questioned whether this was truly an atomic bomb or simply a new type of large conventional weapon. Even if it was atomic, the Americans likely didn't have many more, and Japanese military doctrine and honor demanded resistance to the bitter end. Foreign Minister Shigenari Togo was still hoping that the Soviet Union might mediate a peace agreement more favorable to Japan than unconditional surrender. After the Hiroshima bombing, he sent an urgent telegram to Japan's ambassador in Moscow, insisting they must know the Soviet attitude immediately. He was still pursuing diplomatic options through Moscow even after Hiroshima had been destroyed. Remarkably, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki told his cabinet secretary on the evening of August 6th that he would give his views on ending the war at the next day's cabinet meeting. Even in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima, the Japanese government was still in a deliberative mode, not an emergency mode. They were planning to discuss the issue at the next scheduled meeting, not convening an emergency session immediately. The shock that changed minds. At 4 a.m. on August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima, news reached Tokyo that changed everything. The Soviet Union, which had maintained a neutrality pact with Japan, had declared war and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. The Northern Front, which Japan had counted on remaining stable, had suddenly collapsed. The Soviet invasion was in many ways more strategically devastating than the atomic bomb. It eliminated Japan's last hope for a negotiated peace settlement. It opened a new front that Japan had no resources to defend. Hours after the news of the Soviet invasion reached Tokyo, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. Another 35,000 to 40,000 people died instantly. The message was clear. America had more than one atomic bomb, and they were willing to use them. The combination of these two hammer blows, the Soviet invasion and the second atomic bombing, finally broke the deadlock in the Japanese government. Emperor Hirohito intervened and called for the Supreme Council for the direction of the war to convene immediately. The speed with which this meeting was arranged contrasted sharply with the relatively slow response to Hiroshima alone. The Japanese government had moved deliberately after the first atomic bomb. After the Soviet invasion in Nagasaki, they moved with urgent haste.
The hardliners' last stand. Even as defeat became inevitable, significant portions of the Japanese military refused to accept surrender. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the founder of the kamikaze program, argued that Japan would never be defeated if the nation was prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives in a final special attack effort. After 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet invasion, with Japan's cities in ruins and its military defeated on every front, senior military officers were still advocating for a strategy that would cost 20 million Japanese lives, roughly a quarter of the entire population. This demonstrates how deeply the determination to never surrender was embedded in their thinking. Other military leaders argued that even if Japan couldn't win, they could make an American invasion so costly that the United States would negotiate rather than demanding unconditional capitulation. They pointed to the enormous casualties the Americans had suffered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. This military resistance to surrender wasn't just talk. In the final days before the surrender announcement, a group of military officers attempted a coup, trying to seize control of the government and continue the war. The coup failed, but it demonstrated that acceptance of defeat was far from universal. The Emperor's decision. The Emperor Hirohito made the decision that his military leaders could not or would not make. On August 15, 1945, he gave a recorded radio address announcing Japan's surrender. For most Japanese citizens, this was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice. The emperor's decision to intervene directly was virtually unprecedented. The role of the Japanese emperor was supposed to be largely ceremonial. By taking personal responsibility for the surrender decision, Hirohito was breaking with centuries of tradition. But he understood that without his direct intervention, the military hardliners would continue to resist, and Japan would be destroyed city by city. In his surrender announcement, the emperor made specific reference to the atomic bombs, acknowledging that the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb whose power to do damage was incalculable. He warned that continuing to fight would lead not only to the collapse of the Japanese nation, but to the total extinction of human civilization. This language is significant. The emperor was acknowledging that the atomic bomb represented a new category of weapon, one that threatened not just military defeat, but potential extinction. That recognition came slowly, grudgingly, and even then not universally. What they actually said. So what did the Japanese High Command actually say when they realized Hiroshima had vanished? The historical record shows a range of reactions that evolved over several crucial days. The initial response was confusion. How could communications with an entire city suddenly cease? What could cause such complete destruction with so few aircraft? Officers at headquarters stared at silent telephones and dead telegraph lines, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then came skepticism and denial. Admiral Toyoda and many other Japanese military leaders refused to believe the Americans had successfully built an atomic bomb. They argued it was propaganda or perhaps a very large conventional weapon. Their own scientists had told them how difficult atomic weapons would be to create. Rather than panic, the military leadership moved into analytical mode. Even if this was an atomic bomb, how many could the Americans have? Could Japan survive a few more such attacks while making invasions so costly that America would negotiate? This cold calculation showed how differently the military viewed acceptable losses. Large portions of the military argued for continued fighting regardless of the cost. Vice Admiral Onishi's willingness to sacrifice 20 million lives exemplified this thinking. The concept of surrender was so alien to their ideology that even atomic weapons didn't fundamentally change their position. Only after the combination of Hiroshima, the Soviet invasion, and Nagasaki did reality finally penetrate. As Emperor Hirohito acknowledged, this weapon threatened not just defeat, but potential extinction. That recognition came slowly, grudgingly, and even then, not universally. The lesson of the silence. The story of what the Japanese high command said when Hiroshima vanished is ultimately a story about the power of ideology to resist overwhelming evidence. It took 2 atomic bombs plus a Soviet invasion to force surrender, demonstrating how deeply military culture and concepts of honor were embedded in Japanese leadership thinking. This wasn't simply irrationality. From the military's perspective, surrender meant national extinction anyway. Loss of sovereignty, loss of honor, loss of everything worth defending. If extinction was inevitable, why not die fighting? The atomic bomb changed this calculation by threatening literal physical extinction before any negotiation could occur. But even that realization came slowly, filtered through layers of disbelief, denial, and desperate hope that somehow the situation wasn't as catastrophic as it appeared. The silence from Hiroshima that morning spoke louder than any words could have. An entire city had simply ceased to exist in an instant. Yet it took days for that reality to fully sink in, and even then, some never accepted it. That reluctance to believe the unbelievable, that tendency to filter devastating news through existing beliefs and hopes, remains a profoundly human response to overwhelming catastrophe.